In this video we will talk about Stalin, or more precisely, the most significant drawbacks of his rule. In one of my videos, I already explained why some people may admire Stalin. The link is provided in the video description. Repressions and Gulags are perhaps the most significant aspects for which many people hate Stalin and consider his rule a bloody era. Repressions were an integral part of the Stalinist regime and continued throughout his entire rule, starting from the 1920s until 1953. The number of victims is estimated in the millions. Some experts cite figures ranging from 10 to 50 million. It's essential to understand that such a vast number of victims was not accumulated in 1-2 years, but over more than 30 years of Stalin's rule. The greatest horror of repressions was that one could be accused of anything, based solely on speculation or a neighbor's letter. Without trial or investigation, millions of people were either sent to Siberia or executed. Stalin's repressions spared no one. All layers of the population and all nationalities residing in the Soviet Union suffered. Peasants suffered due to decolonization and mass famines. The inhabitants of Central Asia were forcibly introduced to a settled way of life and compelled to change it. Some ethnic groups were subjected to deportations, and the intelligentsia was shot for criticizing the regime, accusing them of bourgeois nationalism. Anyone could be accused of treason and betrayal to the homeland. This became especially relevant during World War II, and even after the war, when people were accused of espionage. Even the most loyal communists were not spared, as Stalin subjected them to repression for betrayal to the homeland or for their connections with Trotsky. The Gulag system subjected its prisoners to unimaginable hardships, where grueling labor under harsh conditions was the norm. Forced to work in extreme cold, with inadequate clothing and nutrition, inmates struggled to survive each day. The relentless demands of the labor camps led to severe physical and mental exhaustion, with a toll visible on emaciated bodies and haunted expressions. The specter of hunger loomed large over the gulags, as meager rations were often barely sufficient for sustenance. Many succumbed to malnutrition, their bodies weakened and vulnerable to the pervasive diseases that thrived in the crowded and unsanitary conditions. The lack of medical care and proper hygiene turned the camps into breeding grounds for illness, further exacerbating the suffering of the imprisoned. Mass executions were another horrifying aspect of the Gulag experience. The threat of being summarily shot hung over the inmates, serving as a constant reminder of the ruthlessness of the regime, whether through the slow agony of forced labor, the insidious grip of hunger, or the immediate brutality of execution. The Gulags were a living nightmare, etching a painful legacy into the collective memory of those who endured Stalin's reign of terror. If we can highlight successful industrialization as one of Stalin's positives, perhaps the most disastrous reform in the entire existence of the Soviet Union falls into this video: collectivization. The collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union, carried out by Stalin in the early 1930s, is considered one of the reasons for the Holodomor in Ukraine in 1932-1933. Collectivization was part of extensive changes in agrarian policy aimed at establishing state control over rural resources and transforming the traditional structure of the rural population. Besides the fact that millions of Soviet citizens suffered during collectivization, as mentioned earlier, the reform itself was highly unsuccessful economically, leading only to famine and poverty in villages. Interestingly, the essence of collectivization contradicted one of the main communist slogans: "Land to the peasants." It turned out just the opposite. Collectivization involves the confiscation of land from peasants and the creation of collective farms, subject to state control. The main problem of collectivization was that it was enforced, triggering mass uprisings of peasants. Many peasants unwilling to give up their private land opposed this process. In response to the rural population's resistance, Soviet authorities took harsh measures, including food confiscation. This led to Ukrainian peasants being deprived of food and unable to provide for themselves. Moreover, peasants working not on their own land had no motivation to work to their full potential, reducing the efficiency of agricultural lands. Speaking of collectivization, one cannot forget the so-called Law of Three Spikelets, under which small theft from collective farms could result in execution or 10 years in exile. The worst part was that this law was introduced in 1932, a time when famine prevailed in many parts of the country. Separate from the repressions, it's essential to highlight deportations and anti-Semitism during Stalin's era. This led to a reduction in the population of entire nations. Anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union emerged in the 1930s, particularly affecting intra-party struggles, where Jews were often associated with Trotsky, Stalin's main opponent. The rise of anti-Semitism under Stalin occurred after World War II. For example, members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee were repressed in 1948, accusing them of working for Americans. The so-called doctor's plot became no less resonant, where doctors of Jewish origin were accused of murdering prominent Soviet politicians. Jews were also accused of promoting cosmopolitanism, which Stalin considered a hostile capitalist ideology. This term served as a code word for anti-Semitic attacks on intellectuals, artists, writers, and other members of the cultural elite, including Jews. During this campaign, many creative individuals, including many Jews, were arrested, dismissed from their jobs, excluded from professional organizations, and subjected to repression. Regarding deportations, after the end of World War II, many national minorities faced deportations: Chechens, Kalmyks, Crimean Tatars, and others. Deportation primarily took place to Central Asia, and entire nations were accused of betraying the homeland and aiding the Nazis. It's crucial to understand that deportation was not merely the relocation of peoples to other lands. Violence was employed during deportations, with people sent to new lands without food and water. Thousands of people, including women, the elderly, and children, perished during deportations. The return to their homeland and the rehabilitation of many deported peoples occurred only after Stalin's death. Stalin's cult of personality became one of the most massive cults of personality in the entire 20th century. During his rule, Stalin's image became revered almost at the level of a saint or deity. In addition to the abundance of titles bestowed upon Stalin, such as Father of the Peoples or Great Leader, many geographical objects were renamed in his honor, monuments were erected, and fables about his heroism during World War II were invented. Stalin was scrutinized in the media, and his image was deemed infallible. The cult of Stalin ended in 1956, after Khrushchev's report on the cult of personality and its consequences. Accusations against Stalin for groundless and bloodthirsty strategic operations in World War II are reasonably justified. For instance, the initial rejection of defensive strategies and the pursuit of counterattacks led to significant losses. Stalin underestimated intelligence warnings about Germany's impending attack, worsening the USSR initial failures in the war, as Soviet armed forces were insufficiently mobilized and organized. Mass repressions in the Supreme Command of the Red Army at the war's outset affected many experienced military leaders, impacting the army's combat effectiveness. Stalin made numerous military decisions, even in areas where he lacked proper military expertise, negatively influencing the overall strategy. During the Battle of Stalingrad, Stalin was stubborn in defending the city, leading to excessive human losses before the final decision on counteroffensive was made. In terms of casualties, the ratio of Soviet to German forces was unequal, with the Soviet Union losing far more soldiers on the battlefield. The casualty ratio was at least 10 to 13, and some historians suggest a loss ratio of 1 to 2. Roughly speaking, for every German soldier killed, 2 Soviet soldiers perished. Sometimes Stalin's strategic operations were reckless and resulted in significant losses. At the war's outset, there was a shortage of weapons on the battlefield for all soldiers, and some cities were deliberately not evacuated despite knowing about the approaching Nazis.